Hi, everybody. My name is Deepinder Upal. I'm the Chief Architect for TIBCO Federal. I'm also the Director for Vertical Innovation, under which public sector falls. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about a very specific federal and government use case, even though this use case seems to have expanding acceptance in different verticals as well. And that's to talk about cyber threat analytics, specifically around the concept of how to pick up anomaly detection both internally within an organization as well as externally using open source intelligence. We here at TIBCO have utilized this methodology and we found it to showcase a huge amount of good results. So we'd really like to get in on that. So today, as far as an agenda goes, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the need for cyber resiliency, talk about an internal perspective. What are the data sources that we're talking about when we're talking about internally within an organization? Are we talking about a SIEM solution? Are we talking about Q radar? Are we talking about log files that are coming in from an external perspective? And then finally, I'd like to talk about an external perspective as well, and that's to take into account open source intelligence. Prior to my role here at TIBCO, I did work in government, and prior to that, I was in the United States military in signals intelligence. And during that entire time, we've used so much internalized data to find out problem areas when it comes to cyber-related issues. However, that seems to have flipped on its head recently when we start talking about open source intelligence and our ability to take into account all of the data that's external in an organization when we talk about crime servers, when we talk about malicious APIs, malicious malware that's happening all across the globe, and be able to bring that in and deconflict that against an internal perspective. And then finally, I'd like to talk a brief bit about data governance as we start to talk about the internal perspective and taking all of that internal cyber feeds and of course the external perspective where we're taking out all of that public data sources. It's really important to understand which is which. It's really important to understand how to organize that data, make sense of that data, and then finally to understand how to present and orchestrate that data, not only for the SOC analysts, but of course for the executives as well. To start out with, it might be important to cover a little bit when we talk about definitions, simply for the fact that we'll be using these terms over and over again throughout the presentation, but there are also terms that should be understood when anyone is defining any type of pathway to protect themselves when it comes to cyber. The first thing I'd like to cover is zero trust. It's relatively a new term, and I say relatively because we have come across that term due to the expansion of so many different cyber protocols, whether you talk about the idea of expansion of NIST, when you talk about the expansion of FedRAMP control rule sets, even so far as when you start talking about some of the NERC SIP requirements that have been recently released. However, zero trust in this method means an architecture and a policy-related decision to always deny trust and verify, always doing that first, and thus have your policy-related decisions, your data access decisions, your application access decisions rely on not trusting who or what is accessing the environment. Now, the second component here is SOC, Security Operations Center, and that's where we have a lot of the cyber research staff, a lot of the individuals who are doing cyber threat hunting, a lot of the individuals who are going out of their way and protecting an organization or an enterprise against cyber-related events. So when we start talking about a tier one, we're really talking about, hey, look, a tier one SOC monitors threats that exist. When you start talking about tier two, you're talking about incident response. A monitor has detected something as an incident, and now a response or remediation is required. And then eventually we start talking about the concept of tier three. Tier three is evolving the ecosphere and not only relying on a DCO passive posture. Here, DCO means defensive cyber operations. When you get to tier three, now you take things on the offensive and you start to understand what it means to be a threat hunter. Now, threat hunting doesn't necessarily mean you're actively engaging in a pursuit. What it truly means from a DCO perspective, specifically in a security operations center, is now you're taking a look at threats that are incoming but haven't hit your ecosphere yet. What is out there? What is somebody doing? What are they doing locally? How can we go ahead and configure our systems to detect anomalies that are incoming? Then we have SIEM, and that would be security event management systems. So what we're doing there is it connects all the information related to the incoming cyber feeds, related to endpoint security, related to internal firewalls that you've set up. They detect a huge amount of log files, and that includes log files that are coming in from network devices, from servers, from domain access controllers, and of course, from ADFS solutions. What the last two is TTP. We have tactics, techniques, and procedures. And usually TTP is assigned to a person who's trying to hack you, or it's assigned to a state-sponsored agency that's doing some sort of event that you want to track. So here in this presentation, when I use TTP, we're really using it against the aggressor or what the aggressor is pushing forward. That would be a malicious log file, a malicious API, a malicious malware. And then finally, we have OSI, and that'll be at the tail end of the presentation, and that's kind of where we'll talk about open source intelligence, aka using publicly available sources in order to create an intelligence product, in order to deconflict that intelligence against both the SIEM as well as the SOC related log files in order to understand the TTP of a cyber event within a zero trust framework. So here you go, using all those terms at once. Now, I think it's also important to understand the need. Ever since we've talked about emergency management scenarios, even as far back as 2001 with DHS's Dark Winter. DHS, alongside John Hopkins, came forward and talked about emergency management. In their case, they used a test trial run of pretending how would the United States react against a bioterrorist event. So in the process of doing so, they laid out a huge amount of criteria that could be improved for emergency management, to include the need to understand emergency management scenarios, the need to understand what to do when things go out there and start to affect the organization in a way that they're not scheduled to. So here, when we talk about it in a cyber context, we have to understand that we're in the post-COVID world right now, where you see a lot of people working remotely. You see a lot of remote systems access. You see a lot of emergency management scenarios that are currently in play at various federal institutions as well as various enterprise organizations. And because of that, it's important to realize that the fallout from an emergency management scenario is still ever present. A lot of those policies are put in place really in a rushed fashion. A lot of remote working is still happening. And because of that, it's providing a profile and various vectors for cyber intrusion. I think it's also important to note that as we start to evolve as a society, as a government, or even as humanity, you see technology evolving with us. And because of that, every single day you see huge, more sophisticated programs and sophisticated TTPS target government continuity programs that are happening. And here's where you see a lot of cyber initiatives coming forward, attacking government continuity, attacking the idea of saying, if we have a government and they've pushed out a continuity program because of an emergency management scenario, what can we do to hack in? What can we do to take advantage of that? The next need is obvious. A while back, you could talk of the concept of a kinetic attack, a bomb, or somebody going out of their way and doing some sort of terrorist physical attack. And you thought of it separately from a cyber attack. However, in the present day, when we talk about kinetic attacks and we talk about cyber attacks, we see that they're really a false dichotomy. And what I mean by that is whenever there's a kinetic attack, there's always going to be cyber telemetry. Whenever there's a cyber attack, there's always kinetic telemetry. And so you have to understand the scenarios both ways. You have to understand the ability to understand what's going on with kinetics, what's going on with the actual cyber intrusion, and be able to pull out that complicated detection algorithms necessary not only to detect ahead of time, but also for remediation. Also, we have ransomware. I think it's important to note that if you're paying attention to the news, if you're paying attention to anything, ransomware has become a business model for just a huge number of different hacktivists, a huge number of different lone wolves, a huge number of different state-sponsored agencies, in the sense of actually going out of their way to deploy ransomware for some sort of financial effect. And because of that, and because of the increased use and the ease of use of that software, it's become something that you're having to take a look at, specifically across your log files. Then, of course, with emergency management, with remote working, with the increase of data volume, what you have is data sharing and the increased connected intelligence that's required for any enterprise to run. And because of that, what you have is increased opportunity for other people to attack you from a cyber vector. So once again, that needs to be taken a look at. And then finally, last but not least, as we see the increase of technology being ever so prevalent across the ecosystem, we see also the increase of IoT, whether you're talking about narrowband IoT, battlefield IoT, MIoT, LTE IoT, any type of IoT that's working in a semi-connected, disconnected state is just becoming such a popular attack vector for cyber. And that's why it's really, really important to understand it, specifically because as of recently, outside of anomaly detection, you have a lot of limited defensive operations or options. So let's talk about the vectors. Let's talk about more of the need. So when we're talking about that, what we see is when you talk of government, when you talk about the federal workspace, but of course also when you talk about large corporations or critical infrastructure corporations such as energy, such as oil, such as gas pipelines, you see that they're making a move for digital services. And part and parcel of those digital services is to provide citizens a means and methodology to engage not only with the customer, but also engage with the organization as well. So because of that, you see that there's multiple modes and vectors for attack. Also, you have smart city initiatives. Smart city initiatives to take IoT, provide a lot of friendly facilities out to the citizens, also provide, once again, a lot of veins and a lot of vectors for cyber intrusion. And then finally, you have critical infrastructure protection as well. So in this way, you have the threat actor, you have the assets that they're going to attack, and you have to understand what is the vulnerability and kind of take a look at it from that Venn diagram standpoint in order to better assess what we're doing when it comes to anomaly detection. And that can come across all vectors. And here I put the various vectors that often are utilized when people are doing some sort of cyber attack. People can be extremely careless. That's often thought to be the top vector for any type of cyber intrusion. That means using a common password, not updating it, keeping your credentials out, or even an organization not taking their due diligence when it comes to providing key security for key system. Then you have criminals, criminal elements, criminal organizations, and that's where we have a lot of ransomware that's going out. We have a lot of people who are trying to do something for some sort of financial gain. Then, of course, we have a malicious group, and that would be internally malicious, externally malicious, just looking to do some harm to the organization. We have hacktivists. Hacktivists are individuals who are aligned with some political stance or a social media stance, and in that way want to provide some sort of cyber intrusion in order to further those aims. Also, we have lone wolf. Lone wolf are doing it because of their own ideology, specifically to push forward their own specific gain. And then finally, rare However, very, very impactful and very hard to protect yourself against are the nation states. Nation state cyber intrusion are very difficult to detect, and those are backed by large corporations or even in some cases large nation states. So here's kind of the thought process behind internal or external cyber data. And I thought I'd just go ahead and toss in a diagram. And from here, what we see is SOC data coming in, the Security Operations Center. They're bringing in log data extracts, or bringing in threat telemetry. You potentially may even be bringing in social media analytics. And as that data starts to come in, we start to aggregate that data. We start to normalize that data and bring that data into the machine learning and AI processing suite. From there, we start to attribute what are the anomalies? What are the disinformation models that we can pick out? And we have a number of different ML pipelines to aggregate that data, to normalize that data, and to actually find out what is going on when we start talking about anomalies? What is going on when we start talking about a baseline? Now, in this way, not only can we take into account internalized data, but we can also take into account external data sources as well. And that is coming from a lot of external standpoints. It could be coming in from crime servers. It could be coming in from DHS cybersecurity alerts that are incoming. And what we can use with that is deconflict that within our ML pipeline right over here in order to better understand not only the baseline, but be prepared for what else is coming. Above and beyond that, we can take those anomalies, we can store those anomalies, and thus we're able to deconflict against those anomalies in order to define an OIC. OIC and IOCs in this case would be indicators of compromise. And then finally, we have our analytic layer, and that's where our SOC analysts, whether you're talking about an executive view, whether you're talking about a tier 1 to tier 3 SOC, whether you're talking about even data sharing those anomalies and that prospective cyber attack through that cyber telemetry with other organizations. So let's get started. Let's talk about this from an internal conflict log telemetry perspective. So let's kind of lay out the problem from an internal perspective. So as you recall from this diagram, we have all this data that's coming in. And because we have this overwhelming amount of data, what you see is SOC analysts are almost overwhelmed. There's too much data to go through for any human being to actually go through. And therefore, at a very high level, every security operations center endeavors to create playbooks. If they receive an alert, if they see that there's an anomaly present, if they see something that they shouldn't, they can go to their playbook and decide what to do. But as the data sources become that much more complex, as those data sources become that much more in terms of volume, it becomes that much more difficult for SOC analysts to ascertain what is the problem, what is the anomaly, what is the baseline in order to truly put off an event. The second component here when we talk about the problem is SOC analysts are only responding to the last TTP, meaning the last technique, the last indicator of compromise, the last thing that they have seen. They're storing them, they have playbooks assigned to them, but as the baseline changes, as the anomalies become that much more sophisticated, it's difficult for the SOCs to have anything but a reactionary response. So what is the challenges of this problem? How can we help? How can we solve that? With so many logs, so many events, and even if you start to take into account the external perspective, what do you need to do first and foremost? Well, what you need to do is establish a baseline. Take into account all of that log data that's coming in from all of your SOC solutions, all of your SIEM solutions, all of the solutions associated with endpoint protection. And you start to say, what does it mean to be normal? That would be a baseline. Once you've established a baseline, you can now understand that baseline is going to exist as a dynamic entity. And what that means is as that data starts to flow in, sometimes the baseline will increase, sometimes it'll decrease. And against that baseline, now you can start to target what looks like anomalies. And taking a look at those anomalies, what you're able to start to do is ascertain anomaly detection. Also, enhance the SOC, enhance the SIEM solution, and help the analyst take into account this wide variety of different data as it starts to come in. So how do we identify and prevent future threats? We'd use a process of automation upon establishing a baseline, upon establishing all of this data as it's coming in and starting to target what is anomalies. We want to eventually reach a point where whatever data model and whatever anomaly detection model that we're utilizing is automated. And only through automation can we truly promote cyber resiliency. So what are we talking about when we start talking about the ML pipelines and we start talking about getting a baseline for behavior? Well, as I mentioned, as the frequency of that data starts to come in, we see that at certain times the frequency is less, certain times it's high, the volume increases and decreases as well. By understanding and working with the subject matter experts within the SOC, you can establish what base criteria are associated with the data sources in question. So if you're accepting log files that are coming in from a SIEM solution, or you're accepting direct data telemetry from Splunk, an endpoint solution. As that data starts to flow in, you start to ascertain what is considered normal. After considering what is normal, you start to target what you perceive to be outliers and patterns outside of the baseline. Then what you would do is you would deconflict these anomalies and say, okay, are these really anomalies, or are they just denormalization patterns associated with the data? Do I need to treat the data some more? Are they things that we should take into account because of our architecture? Are they just anomalies that are coming in because of system access by authorized personnel just in different areas? And so what we go through a process of remediation where we detect an anomaly. We verify whether it's not going to be an anomaly. And in that process, we start to ascertain a supervised modeling approach to anomaly detection. After finding through that supervised process what would truly be considered anomalous, do we transition from a supervised to an unsupervised approach? And that's where we start to have intelligent alerts being delivered automatically through an ML AI pipeline. And those can be persona driven. Persona driven means if you're an executive, you'll get a good criteria of the high level overview of your ecosystem, including your health, including what attacks have been incoming in frequency, if there's something that you need to pay attention to. But persona-driven alerts also means alerts associated with a SOC analyst, whether it be tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Also, intelligent alerts means integration with your playbooks. And that would mean that your COAs, your course of action, an anomaly is detected. You've now ascertained that it's not just an anomaly, but it's malware. What are you supposed to do? Who are you supposed to call? Who are you supposed to notify? What system access are you supposed to stop? All of those playbooks exist and now would be integrated within that alerting mechanism, that alerting schema, if you will, allowing SOC analysts to now have a greater source of understanding what they need to do, who they need to contact, and what needs to get done. So what's the approach? Let's go through it. The approach is understanding the baseline behavior, detect whatever changes exist, remediate those changes, and understand whether or not those changes that we consider to be anomalous are truly anomalous, or are they threats? If they are threats, what are they? Are they credential issues? Are they an insider threat? Are people coming in from one area of a server and approaching another area of server that they may have access to but very rarely go to? Once we understand those behavior changes, once we understand the idea of what a true anomaly is and the correlation between that anomaly and that threat, what we go is to the delivery phase. And that's where we provide an unsupervised data model, deconflict it with SOC analysts, provide root cause analysis of it, and thus provide a risk management accelerator. And in this case, identify an automated methodology to ascertain anomalies directly associated with cyber intrusion from log files in a high frequency event stream, aka in real time. So here's a breakdown of the phases. And when I say a breakdown of the phases, we say we identify the log data, we go ahead and have a statistical baseline, review the identified events with the SOC analysts, and from their expertise, understand whether those are anomalous or not. And then finally, what we want to do is pass a qualified event to a SOAR process, a security orchestration automated and response process. And that would just be automate the model in an unsupervised state, allowing that cyber resiliency concept to move forward. So here's some deliverables from that type of process, that type of workflow. It's increasing efficiency for SOC analysts, providing dashboarding out for all the different tiers of a SOC, also supporting all of the automated processes associated with the SIEM and SOC solutions already in place. So in simple English, you're not rip and replacing anything. What you're doing is augmenting the tools that you already have with enhanced methodology and enhanced supervised ML models that have been enabled to automatically detect and identify TTP behavior that may be overlooked by current solutions out there. Think of it as a force multiplier for your security SOC solution. Now, let's go to the second half of the equation. So the second half of the equation is going to be the external conflict. So we're well aware of the internal conflict of taking all of that internal data, finding out what is malicious within an organization, within the internal log files. But what about externally? Data that we can find from OSI. How do you do that? So let's lay out the problem just like we did before. How do you track attacks and crime servers all over the world? I mean, when you start talking about global open source intelligence data sources, you're talking about high volumes of data all over the world. How do you take something that's global and be able to understand its value to you in a very localized standpoint? And then how do you stop those SOC analysts from becoming reactionary to TTP? And think about it. When you start talking about the idea of a global standpoint and being able to aggregate that data, there becomes a theory to say, well, if we understood where things were coming from, maybe we could start to establish some protocols. Maybe we could start to become a little bit more prepared rather than waiting until they hit our firewall. So what is the challenge? The challenge is to establish what OSI data sources could we utilize. What and how do I understand that they're relevant, and how to take a global standpoint and provide an automated process in order to provide me that cyber resiliency, but from an external perspective. So much in the same way that we did from the internal perspective, we would do an external perspective as well. What we do is we derive a baseline for global behavior, specifically associated with the global cyber data sources we have access to. So what do we have access to? We have a global repository of crime servers where criminals are housing applications. Which servers are they attacking? Which IPs are they attacking from? We also know IOCs, indications of compromise. What are some cyber telemetry forensics that we can get from other cyber attacks that have happened globally? What sparks exist? In this case, sparks are nothing more than if I identify an indication of compromise, what can I do to remediate it? And then, of course, what ISAC alerts, meaning DHS, CISA cybersecurity alerts, or even individual verticalized alerts from industry can I leverage in order to better understand the global posture? Once I do that, similarly to the internal perspective, I can reveal the anomalies detected from an OSI data load. Okay, the baseline will be a lot higher. The baseline will be a lot bigger. The volume of data will be a lot more. But from that same perspective, I can now start to see actual trends and see where trends are beginning when it comes to cyber attacks all over the world. So I can start to deconflict that with hacktivism tags on Twitter, or deconflict that with a lot of ransomware and social media activity that's advocating lone wolf, hacktivism, even state-sponsored cyber attacks. And from that, bring that internal in the sense of intelligence alerts that can deconflict with a lot of the workflow that we did from the internal perspective. And from that, be able to truly not only understand what's happening internally, but get a better position on external threats and stop being so reactionary. So the approach is quite similar in the sense of providing an understanding of a global baseline, detect and localize behavior changers, not only from insider threat, but in this case, from external global events, deliver and deconflict, once again, an unsupervised data model. Deconflict that unsupervised data model with what's happening and what we've known to have happened on a global perspective, and then thus turn that into a unsupervised model when it comes to a risk management accelerator. So once again, from an external standpoint, what are the data sources that we can take into perspective? We can take into perspective IOCs, Sparks, honeypots, crime servers, and of course the global attack vectors as they start to come in. So what I want to do now is kind of change the pace here just a little bit. In order to understand internalized data and externalized data from all the variety of sources, what we've seen in a number of different campaigns is it's best to understand which data sources you're playing with, which data sources you're taking into your models, which data sources and where they're located. In order to do that, often what happens is we can provide a data catalog for DCO ops. So a data catalog for defensive cyber operations that list out all internal data alongside external data in a category in order to understand what anomaly detection that we can get. So in that way, you're organized. You're not just taking in random data. And therefore, if you're data scientists, your SOC analysts, or even law enforcement that could be working side by side with you, wants to take a look at your data sets in order to understand forensics or understand how to mitigate future threats, they're able to do so. And in that fashion, what you're able to do is drill down to the category of data, directly to the data sources in question, and take a look at what those data connection attributes are, and of course, how to leverage them. So I'm going to stop the presentation now, and I'd like to take a look to see if there's any quick calls, if I can answer any questions that we have. So I don't think that we have anything too pressing, and I know things were a bit late when it comes to the idea of what we're doing. So what I'd like to do now is just turn us over back to our administrators and go from there.